But at the end of the day, hunting and home defense are benefits of the Second Amendment, but not the intrinsic purpose. It is through the ever-inherent threat that we the people could rise against the government that we enshrine and protect all of our other rights. And just like every other right, the right to bear arms comes with an implicit expectation that we will treat our rights with respect and responsibility.
Every time who I am, well, how damn, I'm a man. 6 shooters in both my hands. I'm a cold-blooded brother, a real bad mother. Watch out, honey, here
I am. Welcome back to another episode of Revved Up. Today, we're going to be talking about the scourge of America, the plague that corrupts the very fabric of our society. That's right, we're talking about guns. And we won't stop till every last one of those murder machines have been taken off our streets. All jokes aside, we here at Revved Up are essentially 2A absolutists. Not that I'm some stickler for the rules or anything, but the supreme law of the land does say, shall not be infringed, and as it stands, we have about 20,000 pages of infringements that need to come off the books. Pronto. Now, before we get going today, I just want to say that this video is not going to be bogged down by redundant talking points that we've heard over and over and over again, or statistics that you can find anywhere else on the internet. So we're not going to be talking about the CDC study that showed that there are about 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year against only about 15,000 or so deaths. We aren't going to be talking about how 92% of all mass shootings occur in gun-free zones where victims are ordinated, I don't know if that's a word or not, but ordinated by law to be sitting ducks. And we aren't going to be talking about all the areas that have the strictest gun control tend to have the most gun violence, how criminals don't follow gun laws, or how gun control only takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. All of this stuff is well-known, common knowledge, so we won't be getting into it. But we will be talking about the real reason that the Second Amendment was set in place, why we are all better off for it, and why most anti-gun fervor seems to always stem from people who know nothing about guns. While there will always be rogue actors that, abuse our access to weaponry and betray the faith of our liberties by carrying out senseless acts of violence, we as a nation are safer, stronger, and freer when we have the freedom to determine for ourselves how best to defend ourselves. If it's a Browning 50 cal mounted on my back porch that helps me sleep at night, then damn it, I'm gonna mount a Browning 50 cal to my back porch and sleep like a baby. After all, my home is my castle, and I have every right to defend it in whatever manner I see fit. And if you think I'm being excessive, well then tough shit, because it's not your castle. So your opinion is worth about as much as a Venezuelan bolivar, or, half a Venezuelan bolivar on Zoom Eat Mondays. But if you're under the impression that the Second Amendment is in place just so we can defend our homes, you're missing the spirit of the law and freedom entirely. It is through the Second Amendment that we the people are able to defend all of our other freedoms from tyrannical threats both foreign and domestic. As a precursor to Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japanese Admiral Isakuro Yamamoto advised that you cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. And that's true. With an armed citizenry, we have what amounts to a second standing army, a second line of defense against any foreign invasion. But because we do have a strong military and the Constitution delineates that the primary role of the federal government is to defend our borders and national security, the Second Amendment is actually less about defending against foreign invasion and more about defending against the rise of tyrannical urges that inevitably creep in as political opportunists seek to exploit the public's goodwill and prey upon their emotional volatility. And make no mistake, there are wolves in sheep's clothing that want more than anything to take away your right to bear arms, and they will use your children as political shields for their own agenda. Just look at twice-failed laughingstock in the state of Texas's own homegrown bitch boy, Beto O'Rourke, at last year's Democratic debates.
When we see that being used against children, and in Odessa, I met the mother of a 15-year-old girl who was shot by an AR-15, and that mother watched her bleed to death over the course of an hour because so many other people were shot by that AR-15 in Odessa and Midland. There weren't enough ambulances to get to them in time. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used.
Now, if you think that little dweeb is going to unhook his tighty whities from the gym locker and go door to door interrupting Big Bubba and his beer buddies to politely ask that they relinquish their arsenals to him, then I got a Chinese Bill of Rights to sell you. Now, to be fair, there are some legitimate arguments on the side of gun control. One question that always gets to me is this: how many deaths would have to occur by gun for you as a gun owner to change your stance and give up your gun? And I wrestle with this, I really do. But at the end of the day, after weighing everything, I think I have to lean towards everybody out, yeah. Everybody out, yeah. You didn't really think I was gonna say I'd give up my gun, did you? No, I'm not gonna give up my gun no matter how many people die, because nobody's dying from my gun that isn't trying to kill me. So I'm not gonna give up my gun just because you're scared. And it's always these smarmy, sniveling little weaklings that want to take your guns away, because it means that they can abuse the only thing that is more powerful than you as an individual, the government, against you to decrease your power against them even further. Take, for example, this guy. Hey, I had to see it, so do you. But, you know, it is true. Alright. No, I'm talking about this guy. Look at this pathetic doormat of a man saying that if someone were to break into his house with a gun, he would stand in front of his loved ones, try to talk the guy down, and if the guy decides to shoot him, he'll die with a clean conscience. No, bitch, you won't. You will die, and then you will go straight to hell for being such a pussy that you refuse to defend your loved ones because you are too afraid to own a gun. Who is it that you don't trust with that gun anyway? Either way, that is not righteousness. That is cowardice. You think that guy's just gonna shoot you and run on out the door? Because what you call a family, he calls witnesses. And all you've done is stand by and let some piece of shit slaughter them, completely abdicating your responsibility as a man to protect those weaker than you. And ladies, listen. If you're out on a date with a man and he says he doesn't believe in guns, smile politely, stand up, and in your very sweetest voice possible, remind him, you already have a pussy and you're not looking for another one. Then leave. Resist the urge to be chivalrous by walking him to his Prius, because this man is more likely to hide behind you than defend you if any danger presents itself. I know you might worry about him, but it's not your job to protect him. And while we're talking about the ladies in the audience, each and every one of you should own a gun of your own. Because if you're 5'2", 110 pounds, my ideal woman, by the way, long and leggy, way overrated. But if you're 5'2", 110 pounds, and you get accosted by some goon who's 6'3", 220 pounds, that man is doing to you what he wants, whether you like it or not. But if you're holding a .38 snub nose aimed right at dude's chest, all of a sudden, you just grew by a foot, and he shrank by 2. But back to this Twitter exchange. I actually had a very similar conversation with a guy shortly after moving out here to Los Angeles. I had a roommate at the time, and she had some guy over, and we got to talking about guns, and he seemed very proud to proclaim that if he was ever accosted by someone trying to harm him, instead of shooting the guy, he would rather just let whatever happen happen, and if he died, he died. He seems to think that decision was reached with some unimpeachable sense of pacifist valor, but in fact, it is quite possibly the most selfish response to the gun debate that I have ever heard in my life. And I get it. You don't ever want to know what it feels like to kill a man, and that's fine. Most of us don't. But we're not talking about a situation he asked for. We're talking about him being forced into a position by some lowlife who doesn't give a fuck about whether he lives or dies, and his choice would have been to make his parents, his friends, maybe his children, I don't know if he had any, maybe anyone that loves him, essentially. They would have to deal with the devastating heartbreak of his death, just so that this hypothetical scumbag can have the satisfaction of killing him with impunity. How do you come out of that with a clean conscience? We have a serious problem today with people who mistake weakness for virtue, and it will be the downfall of our culture. Weak men are not to be celebrated. There was a time when our culture understood that the role of the man was to be strong, to be brave and courageous, to protect those who are weaker than us, and to provide for our loved ones, and to stoically carry the weight of the world without crumbling under the pressure. But as American life becomes increasingly comfortable, safe, and easy, our ability to cope with some of the uncomfortable and difficult costs of our freedom has become greatly diminished. There's a saying that society is cyclical, that hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. This is abundantly apparent in the rise of socialism, but the cause for gun control exactly personifies the softening of our society and the loss of American grit that once was and still should be a virtue. We are in the best times of human history, but if we want to preserve that, we must silence the lulling symphony of weak-ass dudery. And that starts with not only rejecting further limitations to our Second Amendment rights, but taking back ground on many of the infringements already in place. Liberals and millennials, but I repeat myself, always like to use the year as some arbitrary justification for why their progressive measures should already be in place. Like, OMG, we should totally have health care. Like, it's 2020, guys, wake the fuck up. But maybe they're right. It is the 20s, and it's high time we bring some 20s shit back. Like flappers. Those are cool. Art Deco. Don't know much about that. The Charleston. I don't know, it's fun, I guess, I don't know. But here we go. Unregistered machine guns. And now, critics of the Second Amendment love to point out that it's insane to think that we would ever go to war with the mighty US military, so I'm not stopping there. Given that the Second Amendment, the spirit of the Second Amendment, was that the citizenry should be able to fight back against the tyrannical government, next on my docket are grenades, RPGs, and fuck it, give us some Apache helicopters while we're at it. Because as you lefties so vigorously point out, how the hell else are we supposed to take on a tyrannical government? Well, that's really a nonsensical assertion, and more on that in a minute. There is historical evidence that the founders absolutely intended for the American citizens to have military-grade weaponry at their disposal. Take, for example, this 1808 letter from John Adams to James Sullivan. Suppose a British cutter should demand to visit and search an American merchant ship of 500 tons burthen, armed with swivels and musketry and perhaps some small pieces of cannon, as merchant ships have a right to be. In those days, a cannon would have been the artillery equivalent of a modern tank. While it is technically legal to own a tank, even after the 1934 National Firearms Act, items like machine guns, silencers, and even tanks with fully operational cannons are technically legal to own, but they are classified as destructive devices, require a ton of paperwork and taxes, and must be registered with the ATF. It's that registration with the ATF I take particular issue with. Ownership of these devices must also be approved by a local sheriff. So if you live anywhere with a population density of 1 per square mile, good luck pulling that off unless you happen to be a filthy rich celebrity or well-connected person of means with lawyers on retainer. So for the average citizen, these weapons are all but off limits. Now I want to take some time to go over some of the arguments against gun rights and why they ultimately fall flat. Now let's start out with the Second Amendment itself. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, a lot of people like to bicker over the use of the term militia and who actually has the right to bear arms. The only operative clause in that sentence is, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state is simply a qualifier for why the people's right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It doesn't say a militia's right to bear arms shall not be infringed, because when the Constitution was crafted, the militia was just the amalgam of people that privately owned weapons, thus being capable of carrying out the functions of a militia. Another part of the wording that gun grabbers love to point to is the phrase well-regulated. Considering that it's contained in the qualifying clause and not the operative clause, it's essentially a throwaway term that is irrelevant to the implementation of the law. But even in its irrelevance, the left still misunderstands the use of the term well-regulated by understanding it in the parlance of our times. When the Constitution was crafted, the term well-regulated did not come with the pretense of federally authorized oversight. Well regulated simply meant well maintained by the owner. So cleaning my gun would be keeping it well regulated. Considering that the entire premise of the Second Amendment was to prevent the rise of authoritarian tyranny, it becomes entirely nonsensical to suggest that the same founding fathers who were so averse to tyrannical government would require our recourse against the tyrannical government to be regulated by the same tyrannical government. It's an entirely illogical conclusion that falls flat on its face under the light of any context. Now let's take a look at another argument, particularly as it pertains to AR-15s and so-called assault rifles. For one, assault rifle is a totally bullshit term that means absolutely nothing. But they like to ask why we need an AR-15 to hunt. The short answer is, we don't. In fact, the AR-15 is not a powerful enough weapon for hunting deer, which means it's most certainly not powerful enough to be a weapon of war, as they like to call it. An AR-15 uses a .223 caliber round that is, especially at long range, not even powerful enough to cleanly take down a deer. That's why most hunters prefer a larger round like a .30-06. Now, as you can see, a .223 and a .30-06, the .223 is much smaller. But for some reason, gun grabbers tended to have no issue with standard deer hunting rifles because even though they fire a much more lethal round, they tend not to have the spooky cosmetics of an AR-15. And this goes to a bigger issue that most of the people who want to restrict our access to guns have no knowledge of guns or are outright liars preying on you and your lack of gun knowledge. After the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, they kept focusing on the speed of the bullet from an AR-15 versus a handgun, as if dance-dodging bullets from a pistol like a Looney Tunes character is well within our wheelhouse, but that added velocity from a rifle gives the killer just the edge he needs against our crafty little twinkle toes. Then you have outright lunatics like Sheila Jackson Lee making claims like this.
I've held an AR-15 in my hand. I wish I had it. It is as heavy as 10 boxes that you might be moving. And the bullet that is utilized, a .50 caliber, these kinds of bullets.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
So while we clearly don't need AR-15s for hunting because, well, they're largely inadequate for hunting, why should we need one for the home defense? One of the best reasons is the same reason that Democrats want to restrict our access to them. They look intimidating. While we should only ever pull a gun if we're willing to pull the trigger, we all hope that the gun itself will defuse the situation and that we don't actually have to pull the trigger and kill somebody. I'm going to go ahead and tell a personal story for this one. Back in about 2007, I was living with a buddy of mine in Decatur, Georgia. His fiance, then wife, hated that I had an AR-15 in the house. Then one day, I hear the door fling open, and I hear her yell, "Quick, grab the gun!" So I grab my AR-15, I rush to the door to find some creepy dude running across our lawn, so I lifted the AR-15, and without even aiming it at him, dude stopped dead in his tracks, put his hands in the air, and walked on off in the other direction. Had I been holding a little .22 or something, maybe he wouldn't have been so intimidated. Maybe he would have kept charging. And maybe I would have actually had to put my resolve to the test. Either way, I'm glad I didn't have to. Also, my buddy's wife never complained about having a gun in the house again, so, that was nice. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and honestly, I could probably go on for hours talking about this subject, but the last thing I want to talk about is this growing notion that if the Second Amendment was about fighting a tyrannical government, then we might as well scrap it because we'll never be able to take on the might of the U.S. military, and at least we can save lives on a daily basis. For one, gun control is not going to save any lives on a daily basis. That has been thoroughly debunked, and so I'm not going to get into that. All the measures of gun control that they have put out there would not have stopped any of these mass shootings, would not have saved any lives. Guns save more lives than they take. So we're not going to go into that, but let's just move on. So to argue that a citizenry with almost 400 million small arms would just be overrun easily by the US military is to announce that you have zero understanding of what a civil conflict would actually look like. For one, you would be assuming that all loyalties within the military would march in lockstep with a tyrannical government that many of them signed up to join against, or to defend against. That would clearly never happen. Second, it would be to assume that it would resemble the first Civil War, where, two armies lined up across a battlefield and just duked it out until the one with the most men and weaponry killed everyone on the other side. But this isn't the 1860s, and wars are never fought like that anymore. It would likely look much more like a cellular insurgency with specialized tactical assaults, covert or otherwise. Now, listen, I'm no military expert, so I'm not going to make an ass out of myself trying to go into exactly what it would look like because I have no clue. But it sure as hell would not resemble the archaic battlefield scenes of centuries past. And if you really don't think a citizenry with 400 million small arms could prove difficult for the US military, how the hell do you explain Afghanistan? We've been over there battling those rock chuckers so long, we don't even know why we're there anymore. Well, I guess we never really did, but that's a subject for another day. Either way, if the poor and desolate Afghani insurgents can handle the US military, I'm pretty confident that our privately owned arsenals are more than capable of keeping the tyrants at bay domestically. Although some RPGs and hand grenades sure would be a nice thing to have. But at the end of the day, hunting and home defense are benefits of the Second Amendment, but not the intrinsic purpose. It is through the ever-inherent threat that we the people could rise against the government that we enshrine and protect all of our other rights. And just like every other right, the right to bear arms comes with an implicit expectation that we will treat our rights with respect and responsibility. Benjamin Franklin once said that those who will sacrifice a little bit of liberty for a little bit of security deserve neither and shall lose both. To take away or even restrict our gun rights is to endanger all of the other rights they protect. And why? Because a small subsection of the population that will abuse their rights and harm others? That is a dastardly manipulative exercise in short-sightedness. And make no mistake, it is a small, even microscopic subsection of our population that abuse our gun rights. America has about 327 million people. Each year, guns account for around 15,000 or so deaths, not accounting for suicides. That means your odds of getting killed by somebody with a gun look like this. Is that a threat so great that you would abandon our primary line of defense and ultimate protection of our freedoms like freedom of speech, religion, assembly, due process? They say an armed populace are citizens, while an unarmed populace are subjects. I, for one, will never be a subject. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe. I'm going to try to put out 1 or 2 of these videos a week, but I do work a full-time job, so if you're interested in seeing more frequent content, please consider contributing to my Subscribestar, Patreon, or PayPal accounts listed below, and don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Ram Thorburn. And as always, rev your engines, ride hard, and fight like hell.
Every time who I am, well, how